to the overview. So this afternoon we'll be covering the budget and funding processes. So included with that is the cost sheet, which displays all of the project cost. And then we'll also go over how to baseline your budget. And then once your budget is baselined, how updates to your budget occur at that point. Now, this is a really important prerequisite for later on cost-related trainings, especially agreements, because Unifier does validate that you have enough budget and funding at a cost code level. So if you are signed up for those later sessions and do want to follow along, I would encourage you to follow along with me today. Or if that's not feasible, to follow up with the recording later and try to get your budget and funding to the same place that we're going to get it to today in the training. So go ahead and if you are going to follow along, log into UAT or the training environment, excuse me, and opened up your project. I'm going to try to go a little bit slower and pause after I take actions so folks can follow along. But again, we are recording for video. So there might be a situation where one or two of you get a little too far behind. And in that case, feel free to use the video to try to do it on your own afterwards, or we can schedule a one-off, more of a one-on-one to get you caught up to speed. I did send out an email to everyone on the invite list with an Excel file that's gonna help us to populate our budget. So please make sure you've got that handy as well. So I'm going to start with the budget. A quick note on the budget. For folks that are more familiar with Famous than Unifier, budget and funding are the same concept nearly in Famous. In Unifier, we're treating them separately. And so that if you don't have full project funding, let's say you've got a large project and they've just given you a partial funding to get started with some feasibility studies. In Unifier, we can reflect that partial funding, but still allow you to load your entire project budget. Catherine has shared the help file references for those of you who are following along in the documentation. I will also remind folks that you can access business process specific help files from within Unifier by clicking on the question mark in any log view and then clicking on the help. Do not select user productivity kit. We are not using that. So I'm in my training project. And under budget and funding management, I have the budget business process. So in the earlier phases of a project, this is where you're going to manage your working budget all the way up until you baseline your budget. Now the workflow for that, I'm just going to pull up briefly here. Budget is a workflow business process. You will only have one budget record in your project once you create it, but also in production, in most instances, you will only have one budget record unless for some reason you need to re-baseline your budget. So what we see here is the workflow that we'll be following today. It's the same workflow that you've got in production. So once you create a budget, you'll have two options. So if the project's getting into Unifier after it's already started and we need to submit the baseline right away because we're already past schematic design approval, we do have that option. Otherwise, for most projects prior to schematic design approval, we'll just be working with a working budget. So we will select that working budget. And the workflow then allows us to update that working budget with this kind of loop here. It just kind of holds for updates until we submit them, until we're ready to submit our baseline, again at schematic design approval, which is then self-verified. Now this process is mainly assigned to the PM/planner, depending on the project. The project coordinator is not included in the workflow for the budget process. So I'm going to go ahead and create the working budget. Again, we're going to eventually baseline this today, so I will go more into the baseline. So when you click create, you'll get the new budget form, where we can enter our brief description. So this might just be working budget or updates as you go along as the design progresses. So you might have an update at SD, update at DD. Sure, let me pause the sharing here. It looks like we're having some folks having some issues with. Okay, so I'm in my project. Along the left-hand side here, you'll see a budget and funding management folder. If you click on that to expand it, we'll see budget underneath there. And what I've done is just clicked on create to pull up my budget form. Again, we'll just have one budget record per project that will get updated as needed. I'm going to resize my window to make get a little more use out of my monitor screen here. And then we'll put in a brief description, and then there's also an optional location for comments. Now the brief description you'll want to be meaningful. Right now we're at the beginning of the project, so this might just be my initial project budget. But as the design progresses and you have new iterations of your project budget estimate, you can update that just to keep track of the last time it was updated, and so that when you go back into Unifier, you know which budget you're looking at and how old it might be or when it was last updated. That's all we need to fill out on this main form here on the budget tab. So next I'm going to move over to line items. And this was where we're going to add our budget detail. We're going to take our project budget and break it out against our cost code structure. One thing to note is we do have the new cost codes in our training projects. So we did work to simplify the cost codes. So anybody who attended the earlier trainings in the spring may remember that the construction cost codes were repeated 3 times, once for new, once for repair, once for renovation. We've knocked that down to just one set of construction codes. And then we've added some additional prefixes to the design services to help you understand when we're allocating cost to schematic design for design bid build versus design build. So I'm going to go ahead and click add. This is going to bring up our line item form to allow us to add cost. Now I've sent everyone an Excel file because we're going to have actually a fairly long or fairly detailed budget. And I don't want to have everybody have to go through and add 26 line items while we wait. So for the sake of expediency, I'm going to show you how to add line items manually, how to build up your budget manually with just a couple examples. And then we're going to import that Excel file just to save us some time. So the first one in the description, I'm going to type construction. For this project, we're early on in the process. I've got kind of an idea of how much construction is going to cost, but I don't necessarily know how that's going to break out into the different systems between mechanical and plumbing and architectural. So I'm just putting in my round number for construction. I need to assign that to a cost code. So for cost codes, we're recommending you always use the little picker button here. I haven't come up with a good name for it yet. It looks like a tag, but we call it a picker in Unifier. But this will bring up the full list of cost codes in your project. Now, by default, everything is expanded. The cost code does have a tree type structure in that detailed cost will roll up to higher levels. And it opens up expanded by default, but there is this little minus sign that you can click to collapse and then click it again to expand. And in that way, you can kind of drill into the different locations. So if I wanted to see what's under professional services, for example. Now for this line item, we're using construction. So I'm going to open up construction. We've got 2 roll-ups for construction, so that's why you're seeing it repeat multiple times. And we're going to use our A01. All of the summary rows we're not able to select. So anything with a little triangle next to it, when I click on that, this select button becomes a light blue and I can't click on it. I'm trying to click on it now, nothing happens. But you'll see when I select a cost code that doesn't have that triangle, it's now a dark blue and I can select it. So now I've selected construction. It's showing me my cost code here, and then the code name just populates there. Description is an optional field. And then I'm going to have everybody put in 600,000 for their construction budget. Just so we all have the same number here. So I've entered my short description, I've selected my cost code, and I've indicated my amount. I've got 3 options at the bottom. If I want to cancel and not save this, I can simply hit cancel. Save will just save this, but then I'll have to click add again to add a new line item. Otherwise, save and add new will save this item and then pull up a form to enter the next item. So I'm going to click save and add new. If you click save or cancel, you can always just click add again to get a new blank form. But by clicking save and add new, it has now added my construction budget item for 600,000 to my list over here, and it gives me a new blank entry field to fill out. All right, let's do furnishings next, or furniture. So in the short description, I'm just going to type furniture. And then in the cost code, I'm going to go ahead and select my picker again. Which again brings up my cost codes. Now I showed you how to expand and collapse to find a code, but of course, just like any picker in Unifier, you'll always get a search and a find on page. I usually recommend the find on page because it just gives you an easy, it's a little bit quicker way to search. So if I start typing FURN, I see furnishings pop up. It just automatically filters my list based on what I'm typing. Now it didn't filter out construction because it still wants to let me know what this cost code rolls up into. And so it's telling me it's rolling up into construction and not something else. So with furnishings highlighted, I can click the select button. And then for furnishings, we've got 20,000. When you're entering amounts in here, it doesn't automatically give you the comma delimiter for thousands. So sometimes you just have to click outside the box or hit tab, and then it'll show you where you're at, and you can double check to make sure you've got the right amount in there. And this time I'm just going to have you click on save. Okay. So this is kind of the one at a time how you can add budget items to your budget. There's also the grid view. So right now we're in the what they call the form view, which is this first button here. When you hover over it, it will tell you. The window button allows us to change to grid view, which gives us more of a spreadsheet type format to allow for a little bit quicker entry of more items. So just to show you what that's like, I'm going to go ahead and click on grid. Oh, question from Brian, if you got a typo in the amounts. Actually, when you click grid, you can also edit anything you've already added. So like if I accidentally put in the wrong amount here, I can just double click on this 20,000 and I can edit this amount. You'll see as soon as I type into something or change something, I have these three buttons pop up in the right, which is cancel, error check, and save. These buttons are specific to this kind of grid view. So anything you're doing here, you're going to want to save. But here I can add additional rows. I can add multiple rows. And then I can just go down the line and add a short description and a cost code. And it's just going to give me a heads up when I have an error because I haven't entered something yet. So short description is required along with cost code and amount. So let's just do one in the grid view to get a feel for it. If you've added extra rows, you can just use the little gear icon to get rid of any of them. So I'm going to remove these. So I just have one blank row. In here, I'm going to type projects labor. Now you can click over to cost code. You can also tap the tab button. And here we'll see our little picker button again, which again brings up our cost codes. I'm going to use that find on page functionality again to search for my project's labor. So as I type projects, it's automatically filtering. And I see projects labor here under facilities management. When I select that, it just takes me right back to the grid view, but now it's populated my cost code. And then I can click into my amount and put in 40,500. Hit tab. Anything you see in purple, so you'll see this purple italicized, that just means that you've entered it in grid view, but you haven't saved it yet. So that's what the color is telling us. So as soon as I click save, the purple disappears and it just becomes regular. To get out of grid mode, you can click back on form view. I know one thing folks get into a lot with grid view or can run into. We just hit save. I'm in grid view. When I click back to budget, it's telling me I have unsaved data, which I don't. I just hit save, but it's a quirk with Unifier in this version. If you just switch to form view, it doesn't give you that error. Okay, so that's adding budget line items one at a time, as well as using grid view. Now, to make sure that we've got enough money in all of the cost codes for future trainings on professional agreements and construction agreements, I do have kind of a detailed budget. So all of you should have received an email from me with this budget interface Excel file. So go ahead and just save that to your desktop or somewhere we can grab it. And now I know you just went through all this work creating these 3 line items, but I'm going to have you delete them because they're in the Excel file already. So, but this is good practice on removing line items once you have them. So right now I've selected this line item number 3, which is my projects labor, which shows me the information in that line item. I could actually edit over here to make changes and save if I needed to. In this case, I'm going to use the gear icon to remove it. Yes, I would like to. So it'll always ask you to confirm. You can also select multiple line items and remove as well, or just do it one at a time. So I'll give everyone just 30 seconds or so to make sure their budget's cleared out. And then I'm going to show you how to import that Excel file I sent. Okay, let's import our file. So at the top, along with our form view and our grid view and our add for adding line items, is an action button. If you click on that actions button, the first option you see is import. If you click on that, it will bring up a little upload window here. If you don't get it, sometimes pop-up blockers will prevent it from happening. So just check to make sure you don't have any kind of message telling you that a pop-up was blocked. And then from here, I can drag and drop, or I can use this little blue browse button here to pull up a file explorer. Otherwise, if I have the file somewhere locally, I don't know if it's going to let me do it. Oh, okay. It's going to let me do it direct from the email. So I can just drag it from the email onto the upload screen. And I'm just going to double check budget interface. So make sure I got the right file. If you don't have the right file, you'll get an error on this next step. And then go ahead and click next. We're not going to add any attachments, so we don't need to do anything here. We're just going to go ahead and click upload. And that's going to bring in our 18 budget items. So everybody's got $1 million project. So some of our business processes do support that import from Excel file functionality. I'm not going to go into detail on doing that for this training because it can get a little bit complicated because you have to get the full cost code string, which you have to do from an export from the cost sheet. So we may come up with a separate training for that. And there's other business processes like construction agreements where we're going to have the contractor fill out a schedule of values, just an Excel file, which will convert into something that you can import. That way they've got an Excel file to fill out and they're not trying to do this in Unifier, and the Excel file will make sure that are using the right cost codes and that it imports correctly. So, but I've imported it. And I've got 1 million. Now at the top, I've got 2 options. I can send or save. Again, save is if I want to save a draft because I'm not done yet. So let's say I got halfway through my budget and then I ran out of time. I had a meeting. I need to pick it up this afternoon or tomorrow. I can click save, which will save it to my drafts, and I can open it back up and continue on. For today's training, we have our full budget in here. So we're going to go ahead and click send. Now in the workflow actions, we'll have 2 options here. So as you may recall from the workflow diagram we were looking at, we can submit baseline or submit working budget. Let's go ahead and submit working budget. And then hit send. It'll give you a little notification that the record has been created successfully. Go ahead and click OK. And then we should all see a record here of 1 million. Your record ID will probably be 1. Mine's 2 because I had to terminate my first budget. So don't worry about that. Once you do that, you may have noticed that you got an email, you got a task. If you go to your task manager and then go to tasks, you'll actually see that budget record here. I've got a bunch of other tasks, but at the very least, you'll see this budget here. And that's because this budget is still in workflow. So it's going to remain in your task list. For anybody who was in the intermediate training, we kind of showed you ways to, if you needed to reorganize or hide that. But it does hang out there until it hits the end. And so you'll have to kind of remember to ignore it until you're ready to baseline it. Because until you're ready to baseline at schematic approval. The only time you're really going into your budget is for updates. So if you need to make an update to your budget. So after creation, we selected submit working budget. So we're at this hold for update step. And that, again, just allows us to open that up and make updates whenever we want. So just be aware that it's going to kind of hang out there until we're ready to baseline, which we'll do a little bit later. So now we have our project budget, but our project isn't funded yet. So we do need to request funding. Before I go to funding, I do want to show you the cost sheet. Oh, looks like somebody got an error about active budget records. So I'm not sure if everybody got my email this morning about your project assignments, but I do want to make sure everybody is working in their assigned project. The only way that error would show up is if more than one budget record is in your project, which might be happening if more than one person is using your project. Let's see here. I'm just going to look up your project quick, Brian. So this was 144. We did keep your same project names from the earlier training earlier this year, but we did inactivate your old ones. So we have clean projects. So the new one should be empty. So I don't see any budgets in here unless we ran into an error inactivating your old one. But you'll want to be in UCB 000144. Okay, I'm just going to show the cost sheet for a bit. So maybe, Brian, you can get your budget into 144 while I'm updating that one, and I'll make sure to inactivate your old project. So apologies, I was clicking a little bit fast there. Under budget and funding management, you'll find your cost sheet. When you first click on that, you'll only have one option in here, which is your project cost sheet. To open your project cost sheet, we're just going to double click on it. Just like the list of cost codes, when you first open it, it opens in an expanded view, but you do have this expand all and collapse all button. And everybody should see their $1 million budget now in the budget column. So your current budget is 1 million. Your working budget will show in your baseline budget. So this is to capture your working or baseline budget. But once you hit baseline, this never changes, and any changes after baseline will show up in column E. But one thing you'll notice is that any of the values in the cost sheet are blue and underlined. And if you hover over them, they just say click to open the link. Because any business process that's reporting to the cost sheet does allow you to then see what transaction created that number. So if I click on this 200,000, it's going to list all of the transactions in Unifier that contributed it. In this case, it was just that initial project budget. And if I double click on that, actually, I might need to use the gear. I should be able to open the budget record from here, but it is not. There we go. It might be a change in the recent version. You used to be able to open up the record directly from the details here, but it is telling us which record contributed to that amount. For the budget, and especially because we only have our initial budget, it's only going to show the one item. Later on in the project, once we've baselined and maybe we've done some transfers out of contingency, you might see some negatives in this budget changes column from contingency as we've moved it to another item. And then if we were to click on the 200,000 in the current budget column, it would show our original 200,000 plus any of those deductive changes in this list as well. So that can be useful if you're not quite sure where a number came from. And this is also a really important form to check as you're adding your agreements, because again, the system is always going to make sure that you have enough funding and budget at a cost code level. So for example, if I open up facilities management, I've got 11,000 in budget for CAD GIS labor, 25.5 grand for engineer labor, and 40.5 grand for project labor. All split out into 3 cost codes. And if I open up construction, and you'll note we have different colors here too. Unifier is automatically coloring each row to tell us it's a summary row. And then anything with cost on it is just gray. So that's what the colors are, just indicating whether or not it's a summary row. Then if I expand construction and I get down into my construction cost codes, I've got 600,000 just in this general construction bucket and another 20,000 in furnishings. But if I get my construction agreement from the contractor and it's broken out between my foundation and roofing and interior construction, when I try to enter that detail into the agreement, if I haven't updated my budget to reallocate those dollars to those cost codes, and likewise with the funding, we will get an error. We'll get more into that when we get into the agreements and amendments training. Lainey, do you want to pause the recording? So also under budget and funding management is our funding request. I'm going to pull up the workflow overview for that as well. So we can just do a little overview before we dive into creating a record. So the funding request, currently the PM, the planner, or the PC can create the funding request. There's not a limitation there. But whoever creates it, they're the ones that get the record goes back to. So just be aware of that. meaning that once it's approved and it comes back to you to send it on for company funding, it's always going back to the creator. So you'll create and send for approval. Funding requests are limited to one speed type per record. So if your project has multiple speed types that it's funding from, you will have to put in multiple records. Because we only want to send this to one person for approval. And then when you send it for approval, as you'll see, you'll be able to select from that clients group. So anybody who attended the user management training, this is where it's important to have the right folks in the clients group so we can select the appropriate approver for that speed type. And then, as Catherine noted, you can include an attachment to each funding request if you want to know, or want to communicate, the full project funding and how much they're funding of the total. Because that is one thing you don't see when you're just doing one funding request per speed type, because they're just going to see how much they're funding, not necessarily what the total is representative. Okay, so we create the request. We'll select our client for approval. They'll either approve or decline or approve with modifications, which will return back to the creator. So let's just use the PM as an example. PM creates it, sends to the client, client returns to the project manager. The project manager will note which action was taken, whether they approved or declined it. If it was declined, they will return for approval. So likely some conversation will happen outside of Unifier as to why it was declined or what needs to change. And then it can be canceled or you can return it for approval. But once it's approved, the PM would then send for company funding, which creates a task for FM accounting. So previously, projects used to have to create a specific email to ask FM accounting at this point to do the company funding. Now it's all built into the workflow in Unifier, so we don't need to do that funding at a company level email anymore. At this point, FM accounting is going to be making sure that there's enough funding at a company level. There's a separate funding sheet that's kind of UCB wide that they manage because each one of those funds may be funding one project or multiple projects. So they need to manage the amount in there before it can be allocated down to the project level. And then also if they need to create a Fund 71 and then update the speed type information there as well. Once FM accounting is done at a company level, they will send it for allocation, which comes back to the PM for cost code allocation. So at this point, all we've done is said we've wanted $1 million from this speed type. Now we need to also break that $1 million out against the cost codes. Again, because Unifier is treating budget and funding separately. We will use line item consolidation to make that step a lot quicker if you haven't seen that yet. And then we'll allocate to close the funding request. So under budget and funding requests, go ahead and click create. I have two options here. You won't have two options. I'm also seeing another workflow that FM accounting sometimes uses when they need to transfer funding, for example, to a Fund 71. In the funding request, kind of similar to the budget, we just have a required brief description and an optional description. I'm going to put in so in today's example, we're going to actually request the full project funding. But of course, this could be a partial funding request. So I might not have the full project budget yet, and I'm only doing a partial funding request. And then later on, you could have additional funding requests to request the remaining funding amounts. Down below in the funding summary, we'll see our previously approved funding, which is 0 because we're just starting. Our current request, which is also 0 because we haven't put in an amount yet. And then what our projected approved funding is. So next I'm going to click on speed type allocation at the top. So here again, we see that line item detail form. We're going to go ahead and click add. Now just to make sure we're all on the same page, I'm going to have everybody put in the same speed type. So under funding source, I'm going to have you type 2020 dash 12012, which should be enough to narrow it down for our speed type here. Now, because we're in the training environment, we can all select the speed type and Unifier won't crash. But in production, again, FM accounting is managing the bank account, so to speak, for those speed types. And so that's why we have that step in the workflow for them to make sure that's funded before it's brought down to the project level. So when you select that, we'll see administration. Oh, and Lainey also put it in the chat if you want to copy and paste it as well. And let's just put in 1 million. If we had any additional comments, we have the optional field here as well. So once everybody has 1 million against our 12,012,714, let's go ahead and hit save. So one thing you'll note is that the speed type has a year prefix. That just allows FM accounting to manage funding per year. And so year over year, they can track how much of that fund was allocated in that year. If you don't see your speed type, you should contact FM accounting to make sure they get it in there, because we can't add the speed types ourselves. So if it's missing and you reach out to FM accounting, they can facilitate getting the speed type in the list there. Okay, I hit save. So now I see my one speed type for 1 million. Again, I can hit save if I want to just save a draft, but we're going to hit send because we're done with this particular step. And then we can type in our approver. So in your projects, I'm going to have you put in myself as the approver. I should show up if you start typing Eric. That way I can move all of your funding approvals along because you're not in the clients group. Or actually, Lainey, I might have you help me out and log in as my proxy to push those through so I can just show the next step. I know I went through all the trouble of adding you to all the projects and then I just told them to send it to myself, but you can log in as my proxy. So go ahead and hit send. And then okay. So there's a question if there's multiple approvers. So if you do have multiple approvers for the same speed type, again, the restriction is one speed type, but if there are multiple approvers, you can send it to more than one person. Once you've added one person, you just click to the right of their name and it allows you to add another person. Okay. So sorry, the client will get an email for approval. They can approve the task in Unifier, but most are just going to be using the email approval. Sorry, I'm just trying to pull it up here. Which looks like this. So it's going to tell them the project in the project, or sorry, in the email subject, it will give the project number. Funding request is sent for your approval and list the funding name. And then gives them a little instruction here not to modify the subject when replying to this email or delete any text, because down below you'll see, in addition to being able to launch into Unifier to take action, they have these three buttons here to take action directly from the email, because they also get a copy of the record as an attachment to the email. So they can open up the PDF, see the funding request, including their speed type, and then they can click approve or decline from here. So I'm going to go ahead and click approve. This creates a new email back to the system with a very specific subject. And if the subject gets modified in any way, Unifier won't recognize the approval. And they can't actually reply to this email either. So from the initial email, they could reply, but it's not going to do anything. They have to click one of the buttons at the bottom, which generates this very specific subject and code. So Unifier knows which record and which project to take action. Unifier is also going to validate that the email address it's coming from, in this case, eric.sukup@sagemethod.com, matches that user's email address in Unifier. So if somebody has their emails forwarded to a Gmail account or something and they try to approve it from there, it will not register in Unifier. It has to come from the email address that we have loaded for them in Unifier. If they add any text to the email, it will show up as a comment on the record. I think they can even attach as well. I don't want to attach anything that big because it'll take forever to show up. Let's do this error message. Send, and then typically within 2 to 3, sometimes 5 to 10 minutes. It will show up. So once Unifier receives the email, it will update the workflow for the record and move it on to the next step. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of activity in the chat. Yes, so if a client's approving a funding request, they could add someone in the CC when they're replying in the email. That email only goes back to Unifier and updates the record in Unifier. It doesn't go anywhere else unless somebody, I'm going to unmute you, Catherine, unless somebody else is CC'd.
So when you clicked on the approve button and it opened up the email,
yep.
There's a CC there. Can I CC?
Yes.
Okay. So that will solve the question everyone's having in the chat box. So this is consensus approval. This isn't, I send it to 3 people and the first person who grabs it is the only approver. Correct? We fixed that.
Yes.
Yes.
I'll double check.
For the case where you have a client and a finance person, they're both receiving this email, but it's not sequential. They both will need to approve it. But if the client needs the finance person to approve it first, it sounds like the finance person can open up the email, copy their client when they're approving it. And then the client will get the second email and go, okay, I can go in and approve now.
Mm-hmm.
Eric, how far do you want me to take all the records past the company funding part?
No, this is just for the approval step, and then it goes back to the project for the coordination and revisions.
And then so your clients aren't going to know how to do this. The few people that have done this, I've highly recommended that you have a call with your client before you send them this email that's going to be auto-generated by Unifier, and actually schedule with them a Zoom so that they can open up the email. You can show them the attachment of the funding request. You can attach the whole small project estimate sheet. That'll be attached, and show them how to just click on the buttons and respond. We'll have super clients that'll get into this really quickly and understand it and do it a lot, but a lot of our projects are a client will only work with once or twice a year and they're not going to remember. So I really recommend having that phone call with them.
Okay, I'm just checking to see here if my funding request has got back to me. Yep. Sometimes this won't refresh. One way, meaning it's updated, but it hasn't told you in the workflow progress that's updated. So sometimes if you just click on funding request to reload the whole log, then it will update the workflow progress. So I can see now that my approval has occurred. So it happened at 1:38. Let's see, my email went out at 1:35, so it took 3 minutes. Once that occurs, because if I'm going to pull up the workflow again, once that occurs, depending on whether they selected approve with modifications, or decline, it's coming back to the creator and it's giving them a task for coordination and revisions. So once they do approve, you do get notified because you do get a task. Now, in the case of multiple approvers where we've got consensus, you won't get that task until everybody you've sent it to has responded. But in most cases with a single approver, once it's approved, it moves on. You get that task notification that it's come back to you. So just to show that, I'm going to go to my task manager and look at my tasks, and I should see one there for funding requests that has been sent for coordination and revisions. And if I open up that funding request task, I'm going to go ahead and make this a little bit bigger. The first thing you'll want to do is check the workflow progress. And I'm going to go ahead and make this a little bit bigger so we can see it. Because they completed the approval step, but we need to know what action they took. In this case, it was approve. But had they selected decline or approve with modifications, chances are they may have let you know outside the system, but it's always good to double check so you know that it was an approve action, because again, they could have selected decline. All right, I'm going to go ahead and click accept. So the purpose of this step is to validate what the approver did, and if necessary, make changes and send it back. But if they approved, then we're just simply going to send it on to our company funding. Lainey, I'm not sure if you've got through everyone's approval or what our status is on that.
I did, yes. Everyone should have been approved.
Okay. So in this case, it's approved. I don't need to make any changes. So I'm just going to send it on by clicking send. Again, if I ever forget where I'm at in the workflow, I can simply check my workflow progress tab, and it's going to tell me what my current step is, and I have access to the graphic as well. When I click send, I have a couple of options here. I can send for company funding, which means the funding request is approved. I'm ready for FM accounting to do their piece. If I needed to make changes, I can return for approval, which will send it back to that approval step. Or I can cancel. So if we need to cancel the request for some reason, I could do that as well. I'm gonna go ahead and select send for company funding. We don't need to tell Unifier where it's going because it's always going to the FM accounting group. And then I'll click send. It's going to then drop out of my task list because now it is a task for FM accounting. In this training project, I'm in the FM accounting group, so I'm still going to see it. But in your projects, it should drop out of the task list. And then Lainey, you should be able to do the next step as yourself or as my proxy. We're both in the FM accounting group. This next step isn't for PMs, PCs, or planners, but I need to get this record along. I'm going to just show you on my funding request the next step. But again, this is the step that FM accounting is doing. So they get a task for the funding request. They're going to validate the speed type and amount. They're going to make sure that speed type has sufficient funding at the company level to be able to fund this project in that amount. And then they're going to say, yes, I've updated company funding, and then also verified that the famous speed types match. And then here, if they need to update the speed type, if there is any change, they could put in the new speed type. So we selected a different speed type. I'm going to go ahead and put that one in. And this is what is going to update project information automatically. So the speed type or types were entered when the project was created. If those speed types changed, or for example, if Fund 71 was created, FM accounting through the funding requests can update the speed type, which will also update the speed type in your project information for you. So again, this is just FM accounting step. You're just watching me do it because it needs to happen. Lainey's doing this in your projects. But when they're done, they're going to send for allocation, which returns the funding request to whoever created the funding request. So I know if Lainey's working hard in the background, pushing those other ones through.
It's good now.
But eventually you should see yours show up in the task list as funding requests sent for cost code allocation. Now this doesn't update automatically. It doesn't refresh on any sort of schedule. So there is a refresh button in your task list to see if something new popped up. Simply clicking on tasks again will also reload the log as well. Or of course I could hit refresh on my browser. Okay, so now I got my task for cost code allocation. I'm not going to accept it yet. If you have that, that's fine. But the purpose of this step is to allocate our funding to the cost codes. So we've asked for $1 million as a lump sum against one speed type, but we haven't allocated that funding to our cost code. Again, because funding and budget are treated separately in Unifier. Now we can use line item consolidation to save us some time when we do that. But I'm going to go ahead and close my funding request because the cost code allocation has its own very specific business process located under budget and funding management called cost code allocation. Now, we did that for a couple of reasons, but the most important is updating your funding allocation as the project progresses. We didn't want folks to have to create a new funding request just because they were going to update their allocation. So early on in the project, you might have $600,000 in construction like we do, but once we get the schedule of values from the contractor and we're going to start breaking it out against plumbing and electrical, HVAC, etc., we don't want to create a new funding request just to move it around. So instead we have a cost code allocation, which is a non-workflow business process that we can update whenever we need to without having to do a new funding request. So cost code allocation is available under budget and funding management. I'm going to go ahead and click create. So this is kind of the tricky part about the funding request process is we're now involving two business processes, but they are linked. The first thing I'm going to do is select my status as active. And then I'm going to select my approved funding reference. Just going to click my picker here. This is going to pull up are approved. So we haven't allocated it yet, but the client's approved it. FM accounting has done their piece. So we're okay to go ahead and select this. Now it's telling me I have $1 million in approved funding, but I have 0 that's been allocated. So we allocated on the cost line items tab. Again, this is just our detail form with line items. Now we could go through and add all 18 items. So if you recall from our budget, we had 18 different cost codes, each with their own amount. However, we do have something called line item consolidation that will allow us to just copy that in from our budget. So under actions is consolidate line items. So import was for that Excel file. Consolidate line items allows us to copy line items from another record in another business process. So when I select that, it's going to pull up a new screen with kind of a wizard. The first thing we're going to do is select where we're going to copy from. So it should already have budget selected as the first option by default. And we've only got one budget record, but you'll see under select business processes, I also have the ability to copy from budget changes and budget transfers. Now we haven't done any yet, so I'm not going to select those. But with the budget BP selected, it's going to list all of the budget records in my project, which of course there's only one. With that highlighted, I see 2 sections down at the bottom. The left side is basically what we're going to copy from, and the right is what we're copying to. It looks more complicated than it is because they give you all this other information that you're not even using. But it's still a fairly easy to use interface. So we just select our record. It shows it down here. If we expand it, we see our 18 budget records. And again, we're just expanding it with that little triangle icon next to the record. And so this is telling us in this record, here are all the line items that I can copy. Now, I can copy these one at a time, or I can copy them all at once. That's what these buttons in the middle are going to help us with. So this first one will copy the selected line items. So that's if you're only doing some of them. Now, typically you're just going to bring in everything, which is the second one, copy all line items. And if you hover over these buttons, it will tell you what it's going to do. So if you ever forget. The top 2 will copy line items over. The bottom 2 will move them back. So I'm going to go ahead and click this double right arrow, which is going to bring all 18 over here. And then they disappear from here. And this is just to help you keep track of which line items you've brought over and which ones you haven't. Now, just because they've disappeared from here doesn't mean they're going to be taken out of the budget at all. This is just a temporary list. And if I needed to move any back, I can just use these buttons. In this case, we're doing the full project budget, so I want everything. If we were just doing partial funding, maybe I would only be including some of the budget items. It's still useful to pull it in, even if you have to change the amount, because it's going to save us from selecting the cost code. So now that all 18 are in my selected line items, I hit done. And then it populates the cost code allocation with all of our budget line items. Totaling to 1 million. If I go back to cost code allocation, now I can see my allocated amount has updated to 1 million. So Unifier doesn't, you will validate that the amount that you've allocated matches what you have in a total approved funding requests, which is important to note. So if I did another funding request for 500,000, when I come back in here, I'm going to select my funding request number 2. My current approved funding will become 1.5 million, and I will then need to allocate a total of 1.5 million because it's just the one cost code allocation. And as you saw from the line item consolidation, this is also exposed to budget transfers and budget changes. So even once we've baselined our budget, and let's say we add new scope through a budget change, you can copy those line items in. I'm going to go ahead and select submit. Now I want to point out something subtle here. It's submit, which is telling us that this is not a workflow BP, versus when it says send, which is a workflow BP. So by hitting submit, it's basically just putting this in a non-editable form. Nobody will ever get a task for this record. This is just something that needs to be updated whenever the funding changes. But it is not a workflow BP. Okay, so we did get a funding request task to do cost code allocation. We've done our cost code allocation, so we can go back to our funding request task and close the loop. This task is essentially just, again, because the cost code allocation BP is non-workflow, it can't send us a task. So we're getting the task and funding request telling us to do it. And then the funding request is going to validate that we've allocated the same, or we've allocated the proper amount. Once we accept that task, there's a new block down here called funding summary, asking us if we've allocated the approved funding amount. Yes, and then it's going to check our allocated amount against our current approved funding and make sure that they match. If they don't, we would get an error when we try to send it. So when we're done, we can go ahead and click send. We still have the ability to cancel from here. I'm not going to cancel. We're just going to mark this that it's been allocated. And that ends the workflow for the funding request. So if I go back to my cost sheet, I should now see my allocated funding column populated. As well as my budget. So allocated funding in column C, 1 million, and then my budget. Now, if I have another funding request, like per my example earlier, let's say we get another 500,000. When it gets to that cost code allocation step, when I go to cost code allocation, I'm not going to create a new record. I'm just going to go ahead and update this existing one. I'm just going to open it up and update that directly. I would select the latest and greatest funding reference, which would be the second, which would be number 2. And then this would reflect my new approved amount, which would be 1.5 million in this example. And then I would just need to make sure that I update my breakout here to total up to 1.5 million. Okay, so I know we're a little out of time. So if people have to drop, I understand. I do need to cover budget transfers and budget changes briefly. So if anybody can hang out, I will be continuing, and of course I'll still be continuing to record. But up until budget, excuse me, up until baseline, we just have a working budget. Oops, this should just see our one. And that's so we can go in here and update it as needed as we go. But once our budget is baselined at schematic design approval, we want to lock that amount so we can report against it, so that any changes or transfers after baseline, excuse me, we can report against. So it's a point in time that we can measure ourselves against. The impact in Unifier with baselining your budget is you have to do your updates through change management. So that's an important part. Pre-baseline, you're just updating your working budget. We've got one working budget. I can go in here and update as needed. After baseline, this becomes locked down and I have to do a budget change or a budget transfer. Budget transfers are for basically moving money around. We're not changing the overall project budget, but maybe I need to move money out of contingency, or steal some from some scope to fund other scope, whatever the process or situation might be. A budget change is when you're increasing or decreasing the overall project budget. Both of these processes are also just the PM and planner in the workflow. I'm going to go back to my budget and baseline that quick so you can see it. So again, this is my working budget. We're just going to pretend we're in schematic design approval, and now my budget is going to be baselined. I still have a task for this working budget to update it. So I do need to push it through workflow. Just going to update my description here. In this case, I don't need to actually update my budget because we're going to baseline it just like it is. When I click send, I got a couple options. I can send for update or I can cancel. Let me pull up the workflow again. We can only submit baseline from this budget update step, and so that's why we have to send for update first. Again, the PM and planner are the only ones involved in this workflow, so anytime you send it, you're sending it to yourself. Just be aware of that in the budget BP. So if I go back to my tasks, of course, now I have a budget task sent for budget updates. I'm going to accept. Again, I'm not making any updates, but I do want to submit this as my baseline, and so that's why I need to send it through this step. Oops, I'll reset my baseline here. So let me pull up the workflow, just show you where we've come. So initially we created our working budget, and then it sat in this hold for update step. And that's to allow us to send any updates. We didn't have any updates, but we needed to get to budget updates in order to baseline. So now we're at budget updates, and we will now have the option to submit baseline and then self-verify. So when I hit send, one of the workflow actions is submit baseline. If I was making an update, I would submit working budget updates, but again, we're submitting our baseline. Okay, now I have a budget task sent for baseline verification. Again, typically in the budget workflow, this is the same person pushing it through. I'll accept the task. So we have this budget verification step because once your budget's baselined, it's stuck. That's what we're using to report against. So we want to make sure that we give you every opportunity to validate that you've got the right numbers in here. I know it can feel a little bit repetitive and redundant to keep sending it to yourself. But in this case, we've double checked the numbers. Everything looks good. So we're going to go ahead and hit send and select verify baseline. If we weren't ready for baseline, if we accidentally sent this to baseline incorrectly, we could also send it back, but I'm going to select verify baseline and then click send. My budget status will change from active to approved. That completes the workflow. So now there's no more budget task in my task manager. And if I go to my budget log here, I'll see my $1 million budget now with the status of approved. So what that means is if I open up my budget, I can no longer change it. It's hit the end of the workflow. It's locked. I can't accept task. Nothing's editable. Everything's locked down. And so after baseline and SD approval, if I need to update my budget, we go to budget transfers or changes. So I'm going to do a quick budget transfer to show the workflow. Budget changes and budget transfers have the exact same workflow. It's just that budget transfers will validate that the total amount of your changes totals up to 0, meaning you've got a deduct of 20,000 from contingency and a total add of 20,000 to various other cost codes, which total up to 0. So again, the PM or planner will create. They can send it to verification to self-verify, and then they will either update the budget, or if they need to, we have the option to cancel. If I click create, brief description, going to utilize some of my contingency. There is a require reason here. If you select other, it will require a comment. I'm going to select this as an unbudgeted expense. Go to my line items and then add my cost code detail. Here again, it's a transfer, so I need to do a deduct. I'll do my deduct first. So I'm going to take money out of my contingency. I'll put in project contingency, find my contingency cost code. and then put in my negative amount. And then let's just go ahead and add this to construction. Now, if you forget how much you had in contingency, of course, because when you select a cost code, it's not showing you the cost sheet. It's just showing you a list of cost codes. Couple of options. You can take a screenshot or print out your cost sheet. Another trick I sometimes use is you can duplicate tabs in Chrome. So if I right click on this tab, I can duplicate. And this will allow me to have my cost sheet open in a separate window while I'm working on my budget transfer. Because normally if I try to go to budget transfer in this, excuse me, in my first tab, it's going to tell me I have an open window. So I'm just going to open up my cost sheet here in this duplicated tab. And I still have my budget transfer open. So now I can see my budget. I forgot how much I had in contingency. Okay, I had 200,000, so I got plenty to take out. So as I'm doing my transfer, I can see that. So I'm just going to add this 20,000 to construction. Again, with my cost sheet open, I can see how much I've got in there right now. Select my construction code. Then put in a positive 20,000. Again, Unifier wants to make sure that my total is 0. So I got 20,000 out of contingency, 20,000 into construction. And then let's go ahead and send. Again, this is just the PM and the planner. And at this point, likely just the PM. So chances are you're going to be self-validating this budget transfer. Let me move my cost sheet over to the side here. So because I've sent that for verification, I now have a task sent for verification for that budget transfer. I'll open up and accept. Or if you attended the intermediate training basics we had last week, you'll know that we do have some options to do this with or without preview to do it even faster than always opening, accepting task, and moving on, especially when you just submitted it and it's a really simple transfer. It's always good to double check your work though, because if you get it wrong, you'll have to do another transfer to correct it. So just going to go ahead and send to update my budget. My other option was cancel, which I don't want to do. So I'll click send. The task will drop off my task list, but the budget transfer will forever be available in my budget transfers log here under change management. And now if I look at my cost sheet, and I hit refresh, I now have a $20,000 approved budget change. So my current budget for construction is $620,000. And if I scroll down to contingency, it should be $180,000 because I took 20,000 out of my 200,000. Budget changes and budget transfers will show here in the same column. Again, the only difference is one is an overall increase or decrease. And anytime we're updating our budget, chances are we also need to update our funding allocation. So just be aware of that, because now we have a current budget of 620,000, but our allocated funding is still only 600,000. So we'd want to go back to the cost code allocation and update that as well. Again, that is a non-workflow BP. So this one we can simply click and change it to edit mode and then make those changes directly. If you've got a very complicated transfer with a lot of line items, you can actually copy those into your cost code allocation by using consolidate line items. Or if you've got a simple one, you can simply change the amounts. So now instead of 200,000, we have 180,000. And instead of 600,000 in construction, let me save that. And if I click on construction, I can change that from 600,000 to 620,000 and save. Again, Unifier just wants to make sure that the total matches my total approved funding. And then it's on me to make sure that it's allocated to the right cost codes. And then when I'm done, I can just hit submit to save that change. Okay, so apologies for going way over, but that concludes budget funding and cost sheet. Lainey, if you want to stop the recording, I'm going to quick unmute anyone who's